It was a quiet, suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names and waved hello as they walked their dogs or watered their lawns. But when the new neighbors moved in next door, things started to feel off. Their house stood out in a sea of cookie-cutter homes with its dark, run-down appearance and overgrown yard. At first, I brushed it off as them just being different, but as the weeks went by, strange and disturbing events began to occur in the neighborhood. Pets started disappearing, and there were reports of eerie howling noises at night. The other neighbors whispered about the new family, speculating that they were involved in some cult or had dark, supernatural powers. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was not right about them. Whenever I saw them outside, I could feel their eyes following me, sending chills down my spine. But I couldn't just accuse them without any proof, so I decided to keep a close eye on them. One day, I woke up to find my mailbox smashed and my car tires slashed. I suspected it was the work of the new neighbors, but I had no evidence. I reported it to the police, but they brushed it off as a random act of vandalism. But then, more disturbing incidents occurred. People in the neighborhood started disappearing, and their bodies were found brutally murdered in the woods behind the new neighbor's house. The police were baffled, and the community was terrified. I couldn't stand by and do nothing, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started investigating the new neighbors, sneaking into their yard at night and peeking into their windows when they were not home. What I found was beyond my worst nightmares. The house was filled with disturbing artwork, satanic symbols, and jars of strange concoctions. I also noticed that they never seemed to leave the house during the day, only venturing out at night. I dug deeper, trying to find any information about the family, but they seemed to have no records of their existence. It was as if they didn't exist before moving into our neighborhood. One night, as I was about to sneak into their yard, I heard screams coming from their house. I quickly hid in the bushes, peeking through the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. The family was performing some kind of twisted ritual in their living room. Burning candles surrounded a pentagram on the floor, and a woman was being sacrificed in the middle. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. But suddenly, my phone rang, and the loud ringtone gave away my hiding spot. The family turned to look in my direction, and I could see their eyes glowing in the dark. Without hesitation, I ran. I could hear their footsteps behind me, and I knew I needed to get out of there quickly. As I reached the fence that separated our yards, I felt a sharp pain in my leg, and I stumbled and fell. In a panic, I crawled under the fence and into my yard, but the new neighbors were now right behind me. I could hear their heavy breathing and deep, guttural growls. I managed to stand up and run towards my house, but they were gaining on me. Just as I reached my front door, I heard a loud screeching sound, and I turned to see a horrifying creature standing behind the new neighbors. It had the body of a human, but its skin was dark and scaly, with sharp claws and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It let out a blood-curdling roar, and the new neighbors stopped in their tracks and turned to face it. I took that opportunity to run inside and lock the door. I quickly called the police and explained everything that had happened. They arrived within minutes, but when they searched the new neighbor's house, it was as if they had vanished into thin air. The police never found any trace of the family or the creature that I saw that night. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that they were still out there, watching and waiting. In the end, I moved away from that neighborhood, unable to live with the trauma and the fear of what I had witnessed. But I know that the new neighbors and their dark secrets will continue to haunt me for the rest of my life. I had just moved into my new apartment, eager to start a new chapter in my life. The building was old, but charming, and the rent was affordable. However, there was something about my neighbor across the hall that made me uneasy from the moment I laid eyes on them. Their name was Mr. Johnson, but I never got a chance to introduce myself properly. Every time I saw him in the hallway, he would simply stare at me with his dark, sunken eyes. His gaze seemed to follow me, even after I passed him by. I brushed it off as my imagination, but as the days went by, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. One night, I was settling into bed when I heard strange noises coming from the apartment across the hall. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes in the building, but the noises grew louder and more insistent. I couldn't sleep with the constant thumping and scratching, so I decided to investigate. I cautiously made my way to Mr. Johnson's door and pressed my ear against it. The noises were coming from inside his apartment, but it was unlike any sound I had heard before. It was almost like a low, guttural growling mixed with whispers. I couldn't place it, but it made my skin crawl. Feeling a surge of fear, I knocked on Mr. Johnson's door, hoping he could explain the strange noises. But there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no response. I was about to give up and go back to my apartment when the noises suddenly stopped. Just when I thought I was alone in the hallway, I heard a faint whisper coming from behind the door. It was a jumble of words that I couldn't make out, but it sounded urgent and desperate. My heart raced as I backed away from the door, my mind reeling with thoughts of what could be lurking inside Mr. Johnson's apartment. As I tried to calm my nerves and go back to bed, the noises started up again, louder and more frantic than before. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched to the landlord's office and demanded an explanation. He told me that Mr. Johnson was an odd man and that I shouldn't worry about him. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I did some research on Mr. Johnson and was shocked by what I found. According to the records, he had lived in the apartment for over 20 years, and the previous tenants had all moved out after only a few months. There were no photos or any other information about him, and it seemed like no one knew anything about Mr. Johnson. My curiosity turned to fear as I realized that I was living next door to a complete stranger with a strange, unnerving presence. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched, even when I was in my own apartment. Every time I saw Mr. Johnson in the hallway, his eyes seemed to pierce through me, as if he knew all my secrets. Desperate for answers, I decided to confront Mr. Johnson once again. This time, I knocked on his door repeatedly until he finally opened it. I was met with an eerie silence as Mr. Johnson stood in the doorway, his eyes boring into mine. "Mr. Johnson, I need to know what's going on. The noises from your apartment are keeping me up at night, and I can't take it anymore," I blurted out. A faint smile crossed his lips before he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with an underlying threat. "You don't want to know what goes on in my apartment at night. It's better if you just leave it alone." I was taken aback by his response, but I was also relieved that I finally got a reaction out of him. As I turned to leave, Mr. Johnson added, "But if you insist on knowing, I suggest you start looking for a new place to live." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder what he meant by them. But I was determined to get to the bottom of the strange noises coming from his apartment. That night, as I lay in bed trying to block out the noises from next door, I suddenly heard a loud crashing sound. It was followed by Mr. Johnson's distressed cries. Without thinking, I rushed to his apartment, breaking down the door in a desperate attempt to help. But what I found inside left me paralyzed with fear. The apartment was empty, except for a single chair in the corner of the living room. And sitting in that chair was Mr. Johnson, his body contorted and twisted in unnatural ways. His dark, sunken eyes were now completely black, and his mouth was stretched into a horrifying scream. At that moment, I realized that Mr. Johnson was not human. Some unknown force had taken over his body, and I was now face to face with it. I wanted to run, but I was frozen with fear. The creature let out a guttural growl before lunging at me, its claws and fangs bared. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed the nearest object, a decorative mirror, and smashed it over the creature's head. It let out an ear-piercing screech before vanishing into thin air. Shaken and terrified, I ran out of the apartment, never looking back. I moved out of the building the very next day, never wanting to set foot inside that cursed apartment again. It took me a while to piece together everything that had happened. I couldn't believe that I had been living next door to a demonic entity all this time. But the one question that still haunted me was, why me? Why did the creature target me? I never got my answer, but one thing was for sure, I was forever changed by the encounter. I couldn't shake off the constant feeling of being watched, and I was now hesitant to trust anyone. The events of that night had shattered my sense of safety and security, and I knew I would never be the same again. From that day forward, I made sure to always trust my gut and never ignore those uneasy feelings. Because you never know what could be lurking just beyond your neighbor's door. As for Mr. Johnson, I could only hope that he found peace in the afterlife, and that his curse would never be passed on to another unsuspecting tenant. I was new to the quiet neighborhood of Arbor Street. As I unloaded my boxes and began to settle into my new home, I couldn't help but notice my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, peeking at me from her window. She had a menacing look on her face that sent shivers down my spine. Mrs. Thompson was an elderly woman who lived alone. She rarely left her house and was known as the neighborhood recluse. The other neighbors warned me to stay away from her, claiming she was strange and had a dark past. But I brushed off their warnings, thinking it was just small-town gossip. However, as the days went by, strange things began to happen in my house. Objects would move on their own, strange noises could be heard at night, and I would often feel like I was being watched. I tried to rationalize these occurrences, but deep down, I knew something was not right. One evening, I heard a knock on my door. I cautiously opened it to find Mrs. Thompson standing there with a friendly smile on her face. I was taken aback, not expecting her to initiate a conversation with me. She invited me over for tea and I accepted, thinking it would be a good opportunity to get to know my neighbor better. As I stepped inside her house, I was hit with a wave of musty, moldy smell. The walls were lined with creepy antique dolls, giving the already eerie atmosphere an extra layer of unsettling vibes. Mrs. Thompson led me to her sitting room where we sat down for tea. The conversation started off normally, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off about her. She kept glancing at me with a strange intensity, almost as if she was trying to read my thoughts. The room suddenly grew cold and I noticed that Mrs. Thompson's hands were ice cold, despite the warm tea we were drinking. As the hours passed, Mrs. Thompson began to open up to me. She spoke about her husband, who had died under mysterious circumstances. She claimed that he was a cruel and controlling man who had kept her locked up in their house for years. Her story gave me goosebumps and I started to feel sorry for her. But then she suddenly changed the subject and started asking me personal questions about my family, my job, and my relationship status. I couldn't understand why she was so interested in my life. As the night went on, her questions became more intrusive, and it felt like she was trying to get inside my head. Feeling unnerved, I made an excuse and left her house. But from that night on, Mrs. Thompson's behavior took a dark turn. She would constantly stand outside my house and stare at me with a sinister grin. I could feel her eyes following me everywhere I went. The unexplained occurrences in my house became more frequent and intense. Doors would slam shut, furniture would move, and I would find strange symbols drawn on the walls. I couldn't understand what was happening and I started to fear for my safety. One night, I woke up to find Mrs. Thompson standing by my bed. She was holding a candle and chanting in a language I didn't understand. I screamed and she disappeared into thin air, leaving behind a faint smell of sulfur. I frantically searched my entire house but found no sign of her. I had had enough and decided to confront Mrs. Thompson. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. As I turned to leave, I saw her standing behind me with a wicked smile. Without saying a word, she grabbed my hand and dragged me inside her house. She took me to her basement, which was filled with strange objects and a pentagram drawn on the floor. I was paralyzed with fear as she started performing some kind of ritual around me. She cackled and chanted, her eyes filled with madness. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew through the basement, putting out all the candles and stopping Mrs. Thompson in her tracks. I saw a shadowy figure emerge from the darkness, growling and snarling in a language I didn't understand. Mrs. Thompson screamed and ran away, disappearing into the darkness. I was able to escape the basement, and ran out of her house, never looking back. The next day, I learned that Mrs. Thompson had disappeared and no one had seen her since. I moved out of the neighborhood as soon as I could, convinced that Mrs. Thompson was involved in some kind of dark, supernatural activities. Years have passed since that terrifying encounter, but I still can't shake off the feeling that Mrs. Thompson's intentions were never good. I often wonder what would have happened to me if I hadn't escaped that night. I hope to never encounter someone like Mrs. Thompson ever again, because that experience still haunts me to this day.